Hello and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I'll be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Lots going on, as usual, especially today here in Israel. We saw pretty unprecedented scenes in the Knesset. We'll get to that in a moment. First of all, I'd like to talk about the region a little bit, and there's a flurry of activity around Sudan, and the last few days, last few weeks, there's been a lot of negotiations between the US government and the Sudanese transition government about taking Sudan off the prescribed terrorist supporters of terrorist list. Basically, they're under boycott, you're not allowed to do dealings with them. And it seems like that's been worked out, that they will pay some sort of compensation to victims of terror. And in response, they will receive a lot of funding, a lot of aid, and Sudan will be taken out of the list of prescribed nations. One of the aspects of this agreement is that Sudan will at some point recognize Israel, will have relations. There's been a lot of talk within Sudan, various Islamic forums, some coming out in favor of normalization, as it's called, with Israel, and others saying no. The ones that are closely tied to the government, it seems, are finding ways to come out with fatwa, Islamic jurisprudence decisions that allow for peaceful relations with Israel. So it seems that's the way things are going. And two ministers in the Israeli government came out today and believes that it could be a matter of days, and certainly before the American elections, that Sudan and Israel will release a third sort of normalization agreement, call it peace treaty, whatever you have. There was even talk today, there was a plane, which, today you can find all these apps where you can map and watch planes, where they take off, where they land. Well, there was one mysterious plane that took off from Israel and went to Sudan, and that is obviously a rarity because there are no direct flights. As I said, we have no formal relations, so that could point to some behind the scenes negotiations, but it certainly seems that Sudan is next in line, and it could certainly happen in days. It's something that the US is working towards. Ambassador Friedman, the US ambassador to Israel, poured a little bit of cold water. He believes that eventually more and more Arab and Islamic countries will come and have formal relations with Israel, but he certainly put no timetable on this and didn't seem to think that anything was imminent, but it's very possible that it seems like something is happening. It's hard to see after Sudan where the next country would come. There's been some talk of Saudi Arabia, but I think Saudi Arabia is, to my mind at least, too big a fish at this point. I think they're probably playing a wait and see game to see how the American elections plays out. But really, as opposed to, let's say, the Emiratis, and to a larger extent, and the Bahrain to a lesser extent, the Saudis don't really gain too much from recognizing Israel and establishing relations. Israel has pretty good relations with the Saudis. They, officials have shared a stage in recent years. There's a lot of intelligence sharing. There's a lot of behind the scenes discussions, negotiations, and certainly Bahrain to a larger extent and UAE to a lesser extent would not have made this move to establish relations with Israel if it wasn't with a Saudi nod, an approval and green light, and the fact that now we're able to fly planes coming to and from Israel and even Israeli planes over Saudi Arabian airspace. These are all signs that Saudi Arabia is certainly moving towards it, but it's inching towards it. I don't see Saudi Arabia coming out to open relations. I think if President Trump wins re-election, perhaps there'll be a bit more emphasis there, but I think they're playing a waiting game, and I don't think they really lack anything from the US at this point. They have very, very close relations with the US. That's under whether it's a Republican or Democratic administration. So I don't really see the Saudis rushing to the table at this point. Again, a lot's going on behind the scenes, but formal, open relations, even especially warm relations that we have the UAE. Bahrain is slightly less. I don't see at the moment. Talking about Bahrain, there was a delegation that went out this week to Bahrain to sign this agreement. It certainly didn't go as far as the UAE agreement. People talk about this as slightly less than open and warm relations. When Israeli delegation went to UAE, it made the front page of every single local newspaper. There was real interest, real groundswell of support. That certainly wasn't the same with Bahrain. It didn't make the front page of any newspaper. And they're treading a lot more carefully, let's say, than UAE. It's certainly not that warmth, that level of warmth. As we saw UAE delegation in Israel signing all sorts of agreements, communications, transportation, science, etc., and a real level of warmth is developing between these two countries. And there's many companies, whether they're governmental or non-governmental companies, that are trying to get in on this. There's a lot of trade between the countries already. They're talking about tourism. Etihad Airways, I believe, just signed an agreement to fly to Israel. I think Arkia, which is the secondary Israeli national charter, well, it's not really a national charter, but Israeli plane, is also signing up to fly direct to the Emirates. So that's really the sort of, I'm sure that's the model that Israel wants around the region. Last night or yesterday, we saw a bit of a flurry of activity in the region. We saw Israel, again, not taking responsibility, not claiming it, but there was an attack on a school, or an empty school, or a school that's been used by a group very close to Hezbollah, which is basically an Iran-backed organization very close to the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. And we heard at least of the 3 people that killed that they were of this known terrorist organizations affiliated with Hezbollah, who had said that they would use that border area with Israel to launch attacks from Syria. So we can see obviously something was going to happen there. So Israel, again, without taking full responsibility, seemed to feel there was something going on there, that they needed to send a message, or maybe these particular people or this unit that was obviously based there were planning something. On the other hand, we had something we hadn't seen in a while. The Israeli army uncovered through its deep underground sensor system a Hamas, actually we don't know if it's Hamas, but a terrorist attack tunnel that actually had come tens of meters into Israel. And certainly if it would have been utilized, could have wrought a lot of damage. A very sophisticated, very big tunnel, very long tunnel, obviously being dug for many months, if not years. But Israel found it, and it's clear that Hamas and other terrorist groups in the Gaza Strip are still trying to look for opportunities to try and attack Israel. Israel responded to this, first of all, by exploding, obviously, the tunnel, but also from attacking some Hamas positions in Gaza. And there was some volleys of rockets across the border, which were taken out by Iron Dome, thankfully. So there was quite a lot going on yesterday on at least 2 of Israel's fronts, on the military front, on the defensive front, let's say. Moving back to closer to home, politically, again, so much going on. Today was a real shock. It's a shocking event. I just saw something about a decision being made, but basically what happened was today, one thing that the opposition had tried to do for a while, as we know, Prime Minister Netanyahu is indicted in 3 cases, case 1000, case 2000, case 4000. Well, case 3000 is probably the most serious out of all of them, but at the moment does not implicate, and probably won't implicate, Prime Minister Netanyahu, but certainly implicates people very, very close to him, family members, close advisors, former business partners, which basically there was some graft and corruption in dealing with buying some German submarines. There's this whole deal that Israel bought some submarines, also Egypt bought some submarines, and it's claimed, or there's an indictment that some Israeli middlemen made money out of this, especially against the defense ministry, which decided we don't need these submarines, and certainly we don't want to see some of these deals being made. So that's a very, very serious case, and a lot of people in the anti-Netanyahu camp have been trying to label him with this. As I said, this week it actually appeared there was a leak, someone very senior in the defense ministry who actually attaches Netanyahu to it. So there was a big call to officially look into the case and see if Netanyahu could be indicted on that. The Attorney General Mandelblit has advised, said that there's not enough evidence for Netanyahu to be tied to that investigation. But the opposition, the Knesset, wanted to open up a parliamentary inquiry, which wouldn't have so much teeth, but it would certainly be a good show. It would look into a lot of the details, and it would certainly be a bit of a PR fail for Netanyahu. Remarkably, for such a big issue, for some reason the coalition weren't there for the vote to establish this inquiry, and the opposition scored a massive victory in managing to get 25 votes for establishing this inquiry against 23 against it. And just as the vote was started, the coalition chair, Miki Zohar, we've talked a lot about him in the past, suddenly approached the acting or the deputy Knesset speaker, a member of the Joint Arab List, and said, we want a vote with names. There's various types of votes in the Knesset. There's just ones where you press a button. There's others where you go name by name and you have to say yes or no. And so the government can call for different types. And they were basically caught unawares and they lost that vote. But then the government basically put pressure on the Knesset speaker, Yariv Levin, from the Likud, to basically annul and void that vote. And there's been massive discussion today. Was that legal? Because there was a subsequent vote, and the cabinet meeting with all the government ministers basically was supposed to talk about the coronavirus issue and all the big problems around that, was broken up just so they could go and vote for a second time. When the opposition understood that they didn't have the numbers, they boycotted the vote. So it was something like 45, 46 to 0. But there's a lot of anger and disappointment about this. Some saying that this shows that there is no democracy. The Knesset is basically useless today because a vote took place and then it was null and void 5 minutes later. A lot going on around that. I did see there was a decision made on that, but I can't see as I'm talking to you. But regardless of what the Knesset legal advisor will say, I'm sure this will be pushed, and it already is being pushed to the Supreme Court. So that's certainly one to watch out on. The talk of this week has been about the ultra-Orthodox. Israel went out of full lockdown to a semi-lockdown on Sunday, where you were allowed to go beyond a kilometer. Kindergartens were open. Small businesses that are not public-facing were open, and a few other things, except for red cities. Red cities were supposed to be in full lockdown, and 90 to 95% of the red cities or red regions were ultra-Orthodox. And rather than remain locked down, there was a decision made, even amongst the mainstream ultra-Orthodox, not the ones on the margins, to basically open up the schools. So tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox kids in the highest infected areas, basically completely, or their parents rather, not the kids because they don't make the decision, the parents, the communities, the communal rabbis, the communal leaders basically decided to fly in the face of the law and open up all the schools, whereas all the other schools in all the other areas have remained closed. There was a big outcry that obviously this is a two-tier process, and they called on Prime Minister Netanyahu to basically try and fulfill the law. And there was all these secret discussions that were exposed and understandings where basically it seems that there were, the laws were not enforced in these areas. There was 1 or 2 fines given out, but the fact that there were hundreds of schools opened up with tens of thousands of kids, basically they got what they wanted. Netanyahu does not want to cause a fight with we've spoken about this before, he doesn't want to cause a fight with his most loyal partners. So basically the ultra-Orthodox appear to be able to do what they want. They want to open up the schools. They want to get back to what they call as normal life as quickly as possible, but they don't want to do anything about the coronavirus. If you go to these areas, you will not see many of the the expected measures, whether it's wearing a face mask, whether it's keeping certain distance. They keep on showing weddings and events of hundreds, if not thousands, of ultra-Orthodox gathering together without masks, without social distancing. And so basically these things are being ignored. Interestingly, after, as I said, on Sunday, the decision was made to open up most of the country except for the red areas. And on Tuesday already, suddenly the red areas were no longer red areas because the numbers had dropped in those areas. Well, if you look at the numbers, and a lot of people pointed this out, the numbers of infections dropped because quite simply people in these areas stopped going to get tested. So obviously if you don't get tested, there'll be no infections. So the government opened up these areas on Tuesday. So they were only locked down for 2 days. And even those 2 days, they didn't adhere to the regulations. And even now, there's supposed to be no schools. They put off the decision even on the first, second, perhaps third or fourth grade, because they said they don't have enough time. This is in the whole country. They said they don't have enough time to fulfill this decision, which is remarkable. Everyone knew there'd be a second wave, and we've been in the second wave already for a month, six weeks now. They're suddenly waking up to the fact that it will take them a month to implement. So there's a lot of disagreements between even ministers within the Likud, whether it's the health minister, who's against the finance minister, who's against the education minister. So there's a lot of squabbles within. Talking about the finance minister, well, the budget seems to be edging forward. There's a lot of backlash about the fact that it's clear that the budget for 2020, let alone 2021, is being used as a political weapon. Miki Zohar, we talked about earlier, the coalition chairman, basically admitted that the budget for the whole country is being held up purely for political reasons. Of course, Yisrael Katz, the finance minister, and even the prime minister disavowed that, but everyone pretty much can see for the fact for themselves that what Miki Zohar said is not exactly a big secret, but the fact that he said it openly, he got a bit of a slap down from more senior people in his party. So those are things that's going on. There's a lot more. And if we had a lot more time, we could talk about those, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you so much. So the first one we have is going back to your first topic with Sudan. Are there any significant economic benefits to Israel from having official relations with Sudan?
Probably not. Sudan is not one of the leading economies in the world, to put it lightly. In fact, it's one of the weakest economies in the world. I think there'll be very little. I don't know of any natural resources in Sudan. I think in the south there are, and that's what part of the civil war was related to over the years. I don't think it's more about that. I think it's more about legitimacy. It's more about keeping the momentum going to make sure at least every so often there'll be another Muslim or Arab country that will, create relations, normalize relations with Israel. So I think it's more about that, trying to create this sort of momentum to see what the next country will be, and to always make sure that there's going to be something on the horizon that's being worked on. And I think it's going to be a win for all. It's a win for the US to show another country coming back into the family of nations, that the Trump administration can make this deal, can bring Sudan in from being isolated, being one of the terror supporting nations. I think it's a win for Sudan because they get taken off the sanctions list, and there's a lot of money that's going to come with that. And for Israel, as I said, it's the diplomatic momentum of having another Arab Muslim country recognizing Israel, establishing relations with Israel. And I think that's a great, that's a great coup for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel in general.
Understood. So what are the chances for diplomatic relations with Oman and Morocco in the near future?
Well, definitely those are two which you would say are probably in the more likely category as perhaps coming in next in line. Again, I don't necessarily see it happening tomorrow or next week, And I think a lot is going to depend on what happens in the US elections. There's a lot of momentum because the Trump administration is putting a lot in this. So I think maybe some of these nations will sort of wait and see to see what happens, to see if Trump gets reelected, if there's a President Biden, because that obviously changes everything in the region. So there's definitely, closer relations. Oman, Prime Minister Netanyahu visited there a number of months ago. Morocco, we had, I think, at least one or two ministers visit there, and there's certainly been talk of establishing relations. So I think they're definitely in the top category of possibly being the next ones to establish some sort of relations with Israel. But I think the next in line is certainly going to be Sudan.
Thank you. So when Israel launches retaliatory strikes against Gaza for the rocket attacks, do they do any real damage to Hamas assets, or are they token strikes to appease the impacted communities?
Probably the latter. Basically, no, they tend to attack relatively minor assets, empty buildings, maybe some sort of weapons depot, something like that. They certainly don't deliver any strategic blow. And probably the reason is for that is because there are intense negotiations between Israel and Hamas to come to some sort of truce for 6 months. We've certainly seen a lessening of the balloon attacks, even the rocket attacks, trying to cross the border and attack Israeli communities. We've seen very, very few of those recently. And I think the reason is because both sides, there's an interest there to try and lower tensions and to try and get the 6-month truce. Netanyahu certainly doesn't want a front with Hamas. And we saw today Qatar basically promised to continue their monthly payments to Gaza, what some on the Israeli opposition call protection payments. And they're going to carry on at least throughout 2021. So there's an interest for Hamas to continue those payments. And for Israel, they certainly, Prime Minister Netanyahu has shown a lack of interest in sort of dealing any strategic blow to Hamas. The idea of just putting it on the low burner, putting it off the table for the moment is certainly in his political interest, let's say. So I think that's where we are at the moment. I think the attacks were just to show, Benny Gantz, when he came into the defense ministry, he said that any attack, there will be a retaliation. So he's keeping to his word, but they were relatively minor retaliatory attacks. And I think it seems that from what we're hearing, that we are getting to the end of the discussions on some sort of truce. So that's probably what lies behind both sides of the equation, the attack across the border in the last 24 hours.
Got it. Is there a religious rationale for the ultra-Orthodox communities not following the legal requirements relating to the virus?
I personally believe it's a more social one. It's about maintaining their way of life. For them, learning Torah day and night, praying in a religious quorum, in a minyan, is paramount for them, even though the Jewish law actually says saving a life is more important than pretty much all of the other laws. But it's a way of life. It's become less about religion, I would say. This is my personal critique. I'm sure we could get someone from that community who could give a better version of that. But my particular critique is that the way of life, maintaining the way of life, the control, making sure that there are strict borders between that world and all other, has become the most important, the uppermost goal of the community, or at least let's say the communal leadership. The interesting thing is that there are three parts of the ultra-Orthodox community, and each one is acting a little bit different. There's the Hasidic part, which again, depending which Hasidic dynasty, there's different extremes. Some are completely not adhering to any laws, and the head rabbi has said, don't wear a mask, carry on praying together, carry on having events. There are other Hasidic dynasties which are basically saying you should not gather together, you should wear a mask all the time. So there's a bit of extreme there. Then you have the Lithuanian, the non-Hasidic group, which there's a bit of a mixed bag on that. They're not going all the way to ignore everything, but they're trying to push the boundaries as much as possible. Their leading rabbi came out this week and said the school should open, and that's why they decided to open. And then you have the Sephardic, the North African, the Middle Eastern ultra-Orthodox, who are a lot more likely to go to the army, a lot more likely to work, a lot more likely to mix with non-ultra-Orthodox people. And interestingly, in that community, perhaps because of their intertwinement with the general community, they have not been opening their schools, and they have been keeping the regulations almost completely. So, maybe sometimes simplistically, we talk about the ultra-Orthodox community as one monolithic body, but there's a lot going in there. But on the whole, in the last week, we did see this mass communal civil, some would call it civil disobedience, breaking the law, whatever you want to call it, by basically just deciding we're going to open our schools anyway, regardless of the fact that it's illegal under the current Israeli regulations.
So follow up on that, how does the general Israeli population feel about the ultra-Orthodox not adhering to the regulations? Has there been any sort of upheaval?
Well, there's been a simmering discontent with that. There's a feeling that there are some have called it a state within a state, two systems for one population, or two systems for two populations. Some have even sort of quipped that this is two states for two people. But there's been a lot of anger because people can't go to work, people are suffering, unemployment is an all-time high, businesses are closing by the day, people, children are at home, they can't go to school. And then we see a community completely being disobedient, not listening to any of this. And we see a correlation between that and the extremely high infection rates. And don't forget, when they do the national infection rates, they don't split them up into communities. So when the numbers go up, the restrictions also go up. So as long as there's a certain amount of the community, they're about 11% of the country, but they're 50% of infections. So then as long as they continue acting the way they do and infections continue to rise, we're going to be in a third lockdown, or even we're not going to get out of the second lockdown. So there's been a lot of anger. There's been a lot of questioning why Netanyahu should be allowing such a thing to take place. And every day on the news, there's pictures of weddings taking place with thousands of people, events, taking place, hundreds of people dancing together, arm in arm. It's as if coronavirus doesn't exist. So yes, there is a big backlash, and certainly the community hasn't done itself any favors in feeling as part of wider community and doing outreach and saying, we're in this together. They see themselves. It appears that this is what the rest of the country are feeling, that they are deciding that the rest of the country is irrelevant to them. Only what goes on in their community is important. Doesn't matter if people can't go out to work, school, run a business, as long as they're able to maintain their lifestyle, that's all that matters at this point to them. And obviously that creates a bit of a distaste in the mouth from a lot of other Israelis.
Of course, I'm sure. So going back to a question that we've asked pretty much every single week, but the question or the answer is always different. What odds would you give that the current government coalition will last, and what would be the possible makeup of a future coalition if this one fails?
We saw another poll which shows, Bennett edging closer to Netanyahu. Netanyahu was asked, interestingly, in the Knesset, there's always a stakeout by media right outside his Knesset office, and he's walking in and out, whether to vote or whatever it is. And usually people are shouting questions at him, and as the consummate politician, he usually ignores most of them. But we saw this week, he was asked about the polls, and he made a very telling comment. He says, "I never do well in polls. I do well in elections," with a very smug grin on his face. First of all, that's to a large extent that's true. But it seems like, one of his exit points, we talked a lot about exit points that are on the calendar, on the map, where he can leave, where the government can be dissolved without him having to hand over the keys to the Prime Minister's office to alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz. And one of them will be on December 23rd, when the budget has to be passed. If it is not, automatically the government dissolved. But it's now, most commentators believe that Netanyahu won't take that particular point, probably because of the polls, probably because he understands we're not going to be completely out of the woods as far as coronavirus, and certainly not in the economy. So that leaves a possibility of March, because that will be 3 months. The next budget will have to be 3 months into the year. And he wants to retain that exit point. And that's where Gantz comes in. And Gantz has said, if I do not see serious work on the 2021 budget by the end of November, we're going to take steps, whether that, there are some threats that he has. One of the threats was this investigation into the submarine affair, case 3000. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Another one is that, in theory, at least, and this remains in theory at this point, there is a majority in the Knesset that could pass a law that could ensure that a prime minister is not allowed to sit in office under indictment. At the moment, it's only ministers, and there was a big legal discussion about it. But I think there's 62-63 if blue and white decided to cross the aisle with the opposition. So that remains a threat. That would certainly be a big worry for Netanyahu, because that would basically mean that he could not sit in the prime minister's office until after his case, if he was acquitted, that is. But it's largely empty because you would need quite a wide variety of coalition partners to vote for that. You'd need Yamina, you'd need Blue and White, you would need the Arab list, you would need Israel Beitenu, all to vote for it. And you've got to rely on the fact that, do they care more about deposing Netanyahu than they do about working together? So there's a few things going on there. But it seems like we're not going to go to elections in December, but my feeling is that they will still remain this exit point in March, and depending on, that will be the last exit point until Gantz becomes prime minister in November. So I think that's highly unlikely. I've said that since the beginning. So my prediction is March, but one never knows if something happens in the next few weeks. He's got until December, but I think they'll work that out. And I think March is probably the most likely and possibly the only remaining time to call elections before Gantz takes over the prime minister's office.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Nick Larigakis discussing Congress counters Turkey. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.